Ground Control course. This lesson will go over the basics of ground control and the phraseology associated with its responsibilities. Without further ado, let's talk about what ground control is responsible for. Ground's main responsibilities are pushback and taxi operations, and of course ensuring that there are no conflicts between aircraft pushing back and taxiing. Remember that under top-down procedures, if delivery is offline, then ground is also responsible for clearances. This is not optional. You can't choose to not do clearances if delivery is offline. Generally speaking, ground is responsible for all taxiways between the gates and the nearest runway. Taxiways between runways are not ground's responsibility. At Tofon, for example, ground is responsible for all taxiways north of runway 27 right, while at Delarue, ground is responsible for taxiway Alpha and its surrounding taxiways. Now let's get into the first of ground's main responsibilities, pushback. If you don't know what pushback is, it is when an aircraft is pushed from their gate backwards onto the taxiway. It's very similar to a car backing out of their garage onto the street. After or while pushing back, pilots will generally also start their engines, hence the phrase push and start you may have heard before. As ground control, you are only responsible for some pushbacks. Pilots parked at the small stands at Wellensaal or in the medium gates that will push back onto Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, or Delta at Tofon are responsible for their own pushback after they receive their clearance from delivery. If the pilot requests pushback, you can tell them, push and start is at your discretion, advise when ready for taxi. You can refer to the SOPs for which gates require pushback instructions from ATC. As for the pushbacks you are responsible for, the phraseology would be push and start approved, followed by the cardinal direction you want the pilot to be facing after they finish pushback. It can also help you if you ask the pilot to advise ready for taxi with their pushback instructions so you know when they're ready. Make a note to never use the words clear or cleared as ground, both in pushback and taxi instructions. Also, if there is a taxiing aircraft behind an aircraft pushing back, allow the taxiing aircraft to pass before pushing back so that they don't have to wait. Pushing back and starting up engines takes much longer than taxiing by. If you need an aircraft to wait, feel free to use standby phraseology. As mentioned earlier, you are responsible for clearances if delivery is offline, and also, aircraft must have their clearance before pushing back. When pilots finish their readback correctly, they must still be told readback correct, but they would no longer be told to contact ground since you already are ground. Thus, you can instead say, advise ready for push and start, or push and start is at your discretion, advise ready for taxi, depending on their gate. Please also know that clearance delivery is the only time you have to say readback correct. Readbacks are still required, but when a pilot reads back pushback or taxi instructions, for example, you don't need to reply unless they have read back incorrectly. Your other main responsibility as ground will be to issue taxi instructions. Taxi instructions tell aircraft how to get from one place to another on the ground by detailing what taxiways the aircraft should use. Try to issue routes with the least number of turns required, as well as the shortest routes, so pilots can spend more time flying. Don't compromise safety to give quicker routes, though. All taxiways are named with a unique letter in the phonetic alphabet, though there are some taxiways that also have numbers in their names. For these taxiways, you would just say the number after the phonetic letter. For example, Foxtrot 1. One definition you should know is that holding points are taxiways that lead to a runway. At Tofon, on the north side of runway 27 right, the holding points are Gulf 5, 4, Tree, 2, 1, and Hotel. As for the phraseology, as usual, start with the call sign, then state the runway they are taxiing to, essentially their quote-unquote destination, then taxi via, followed by the taxi instructions. If you are taxiing aircraft to a holding point that isn't at the end of the runway, Gulf 4 for example, you would say runway 27 right at Gulf 4, taxi via, followed by the taxi instructions. You can see the SOP for aircraft types that should be taxied to different holding points. In the example here, the ground controller would say WestJet 2166, runway 27 right, taxi via Bravo, Foxtrot 2, Golf, Golf 5. As ground, you'll also have to handle a bit of arriving traffic. On first contact with arrivals, if the pilot doesn't state a gate that they want, then you will have to ask them if they have a preference. When giving taxi instructions, again start with the destination, making sure to include the word gate, followed by the taxi instructions. You must use the word gate or stand, which mean the same thing, since some gate numbers may sound like taxiway names. For this example, the controller has already learned that the pilot would like gate Charlie 22 and says, Turkish Tree 79er, gate Charlie 22, taxi via Golf, Foxtrot 1, Charlie. If there is a case where the pilot doesn't care where they park and you don't want to assign a gate, you can also give the pilot taxi instructions in the direction of the gates, then tell them that parking is at their discretion. You cannot, however, just tell pilots that taxi is at their discretion. Just like with delivery, when you're done talking to an aircraft, you must hand them off to the next controller. Arriving aircraft will simply park at the gate and be done. They don't need to be handed off to anyone. Departing aircraft will normally be handed off to tower. However, remember that if tower is offline, the aircraft should be handed off to the next online controller above tower. Aircraft should be handed off as they are nearing the holding point and no longer need further instructions from you. We don't want to wait until they have stopped at the holding point because it would be inefficient, and handing them off earlier can keep traffic moving. Of course, if there is a conflict and/or you still need to talk to the pilot, don't hand them off until that is resolved. Lastly, there is no strict restriction on taxi speeds, and these are the pilot's discretion. However, they should not be dangerously fast or taxiing into other airplanes. For reference, aircraft in the real world tend to taxi around 15 to 20 knots. You can't assign specific taxi speeds, but you can advise aircraft if they are going too fast and ask them to slow down. There isn't specific phraseology for this, so just use plain language. That's all for this lesson. Ask us questions if you have any, and with that, we'll see you on the scopes.